Finally, I can't even remember when I began, and I didn't put a stopwatch, but I'll keep going for a little while. Sorry if I'm tiring you out, but I know that this is supposed to go on till 9, and I think a lot of you are going to probably leave in the break period, so I'll just keep going for a little while. When it comes to, the problem, so-called problem of Islamic law, whether it has to do with women or with others, I think the main issue that we really have to grapple with, and this is an area where Muslim scholars are really only starting to look at things in depth and with some sophistication, is the extent to which law should be used to ensure that society is, one, secure, and second, moral. And let me talk a little bit about these things. You see, again, you're in Canada, so I'm not quite sure. I heard about Bill C-36, but I'm not quite sure of all the dynamics. The only time I ever read about Canada in the newspaper in the United States this year was the last week when every day this figure skating pair was on the front page of the newspaper. I was talking to my mother. I said, I never read the word Canada in the New York Times, and then all week they're talking about Canada. So it's like you're a different universe or something. So it's hard for me to follow the news unless I go on the internet. But at least in the United States since September 11th, what's interesting is to see how a society that has defined itself as a society essentially created to provide an environment so that people could exercise their freedom has increasingly defined itself as a society that necessarily and primarily needs to be secure. And so the balance between freedom and security is shifting. And over and over and over we hear justifications about limits on freedom in order to make society more secure and safe. Because if a government cannot make a society secure, and if you aren't secure and safe, you obviously cannot exercise your freedoms. So that's something that every society, every political theory, every constitutional system needs to grapple with. And what we see in many Muslim societies is that there are many threats, and there have been many threats to them politically. We also see that materially they're very insecure. Their economies are very insecure and vulnerable. And because of many different kinds of insecurity, there have been limits on freedoms. And this does not mean that all of these limits are justified, but it means that we have to understand that in any society there's a dynamic that engages, and it's not because people are necessarily anti-freedom or because they're necessarily tyrannical or they love tyranny or they have some kind of immature existential development so they can't embrace freedom. Is because there's often many factors in society that make people want to look first and foremost at security. The second area is morality. Any society has a debate about what is in the public interest and what is good for the people. Now, if we look at Canadian society, for example, we see that I believe that it's required to wear helmets if you ride a motorcycle in Ontario. Is that correct? Okay, if you tried to make that a law in Texas, you would never, ever be elected. That would be considered a fundamental violation of personal freedom. I mean, this is my body. This is my head. This is my life. How can you force me to put a hat on my head, a helmet on my head? That is something that in a place like Texas would be inconceivable. Yet in this society, in Ontario, we wouldn't even bat an eye. we don't feel it's oppressive because we've embraced the idea, it's a social norm now, that that is in our best interest and the government has a right to protect us and to ensure that if we are not taking care of ourselves, that the government will take care of us. Now, I think when it was first introduced in Ontario, there's probably a lot of debate, but now we've got used to it. Same thing with seat belts. I mean, you know, you're forcing someone to do something on their body in their own car, and why is that? Because we believe that there's a certain that the interests of society are greater than the personal freedom of the individual, to the point where we will fine them. It's a crime not to do it. A small crime, but it is still a crime. So that the notion that society can restrict individual freedoms for the sake of a greater social good is not unheard of in Canadian society. Now, different societies have different ideas of what is harmful to the social structure. Different ideas, different societies weigh different values differently. So, for example, here maybe the reason why seatbelts are required more than anything is because the government the government pays for health care and it's too expensive. So cost, right, outweighs personal freedom. In other societies, you have similar concerns, but you have different costs. You have society bearing different kind of costs. So that when we are trying to compare Muslim societies with our society, with Canadian society or American society, we should try to find, first of all, what are structurally parallel ideas and concepts before we just rush in and say this thing is a unacceptable limit on personal freedom. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't debate. We can debate. And certainly in some areas there are limits that maybe seem very unreasonable. And there are some limits in some Muslim societies that seem unreasonable to me and unreasonable to the people in that society. But these things should be debated in a framework that's understandable to everyone and not exoticized to the point where it's so strange we can't even understand it. These are not strange concepts. These are concepts that exist in every society. Now, one of the areas that I believe that Muslims need to address most critically is the idea of potential harm, because I think this is where sometimes Muslim societies go overboard. And that is that if there's a risk of something prohibited happening or something harmful happening, that you try to block the means to that. There's a term in Islamic law called sadd al-dharaya, which means blocking the means. Now, that is, for example, what was done in Afghanistan to forbid girls from going to school. They said, if they go to school, when they're out on the street, someone may say something bad to them or look at them in a bad way or attack them or kidnap them, or if women work in the government offices, then maybe some bureaucrat in the office will proposition them, and this will lead to them being taken advantage of sexually, and then this will lead to adultery, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this chain reaction. Now, part of the problem that I believe that part of their mistake was that they didn't look at other risks, because there are always multiple risks involved. So that what about, anyone who makes this kind of reasoning to the logical extreme has to reason the other way to the illogical extreme. Okay, what are the possible harms that can come from banning girls from school? Well, they won't learn to read. They won't be able to learn about their religion. They won't be able to teach their children. They won't be able to take care of their own health care needs. Society will be deprived of their intelligence and their perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then if you did a proper risk-benefit analysis, you would probably come out with the right solution. But to make sure that the proper risk-benefit analysis is done in any society, you have to make sure that you have people who can see, people can see all the different perspectives there.